I am glad that you are back with me on this fifth week of discussion about our book, God Loves Justice. And look, if you've come this far, you should pat yourself on the back. I mean, you've done the bulk of the reading, and that's great. In fact, next week, we just have one chapter and then the appendix, and we finish and wrap everything up. So if you're here, if you've done the reading, I really appreciate you sticking through it. If you haven't caught up yet, that's okay. You have some time, and I encourage you to do that. But feel free to join right in with this discussion today. And so as we jump right into the book, we're looking at chapters 13, 14, and 15 today. And what we begin to see is that here in chapter 13, Nicholas jumps right into the New Testament and how the New Testament talks about justice and righteousness. She says often we think that it's hidden there. It's hard to see it. But as we really understand what justice and righteousness is, we begin to know and see clearly that it's right there in the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus, the life and ministry of Jesus, even in Paul. So she uses the Sermon on the Mount as the best example of justice and righteousness. And she takes the Sermon on the Mount and she compares it with the religious life and the religious leaders of the day. And she talks about the Pharisees and how the Pharisees viewed righteousness as this hyper extension of the law, that they had amped up the law of Moses with lots of regulations, and they viewed people's righteousness by how well they followed those rules. And what this produced was an outward righteousness that showed nothing about one's heart. And so what we see in the Sermon on the Mount is we see a transformation of heart, that those who are blessed are those who see something on the inside and are being changed on the inside and have a depth in their inward being. And so Nicholas uses the Sermon on the Mount. She walks through the Sermon on the Mount that talks about our true righteousness and true life of justice comes from an inward transformation. Now, she points out that we can't achieve this righteousness, this rightness with God by ourselves, that we need God, and that God's love comes to set us free from our sins and gives us this hope of a right relationship with God. And so knowing that we need God helps us then to live into God's way of restoring the world. And that's part of the justice, right? Part of the creating the shalom is our work. We know we can't achieve it on our own. We need God. We seek an inward transformation. And then through God's work, we join God in making the shalom. So she breaks down the Sermon on the Mount and does an excellent job with it. And then I like how she used examples to show how this works out in life. And she talks about the civil rights movement and how the civil rights movement had within it an influence from an African-American man named Howard Thurman, who was a preacher, he was a teacher, he was a scholar. And Howard's work really helped to transform the hearts of the leaders of the civil rights movement. In fact, she talked about how Martin Luther King often used his book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And I happen to have my own copy right here, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. But what Nicholas shows is that what Thurman talks about is how the disinherited seek to transform life, not by attacking the oppressors, but by being transformed and not being overcome by things like fear, deception, and hatred. That we, in a sense, overcome these things, and then as we overcome these things, we become a light and example to the world. And that moved the civil rights movement forward, and that caused the civil rights movement, I believe, to be successful. So the civil rights movement was something that changed because of a transformation on the inside. And so we continue to hear Nicholas talk and read through that chapter. And she quotes a German theologian who says, redemption, like sin, takes place within existing social structures, so that the first priority is not to change the structures, but to achieve a life which is conformable to that of Jesus. Such a life will in due time break down the structures. And then she continues to say, time and time again, we see God's people taking his heart to see people thrive and using their own lives to make Jesus's on earth as it is in heaven prayer a practical reality. The gospel is not dependent on human systems, but human systems can be transformed when the people of God rise up as salt and light of God. So the Sermon on the Mount talks about our inward transformation, but it's not just so we can separate and be righteous on our own, but it's so we can be light to the world and bring about changes within the social structures of our lives. Then as she moves into chapter 14, Nicholas continues to talk about other places in the New Testament where we see justice and righteousness. She talks about Paul's teaching, especially about Paul's understanding of freedom and grace and how that sets us free to be people of God. And she talks about this example of the tutor, which actually in the Hellenistic world was a slave who was instructed to shape and form a child, that they would spend their entire lives with this child, shaping their morality and teaching them. And then when the child became an adolescent, they would be set out into the world. And as they are set out into the world, they would either live a righteous life or crash and burn. And so Paul or Nicholas says that example, she's using Paul's example here, is that the law gives us instruction and guidance, but eventually we have to live it without just following the law. We have to live a true life. And then she explains that. She really shows the example of that in the story of the Good Samaritan. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, what we find is that the religious people of the day fail the person who is left to die. And so the religious people, the priest and the Levite, might very well be following religious laws. If they touch a dead person, they were defiled, and they would have been keeping important rules. But in keeping those rules, they left the person to die. And so then we see in the Samaritan that he would not allow the person to die. He was moved by compassion. And so what we need to understand in this work of true righteousness is, do our rules leave people to die, leave people to suffer? And Nicholas goes on to say, she says, I think many of us Christians have been trained to be passive toward injustice because we have been trained to respond to suffering with intellectual reasoning. And when we find that reason, that is enough for us to explain away our role in bringing change. An example of that are the priest and the Levite, right? They intellectualize why they shouldn't help the person, and they left the person to die. So this means that neither guilt nor obligation moved the Samaritan to respond to injustice. He was motivated by something else entirely, compassion. That's what Nicholas says. Then as she moves into the 15th chapter, she begins to talk about how we then need to live this life. We see how it's taught in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but how do we live our lives? And she says something very interesting in the beginning. She says, you will probably spend something like 5% of your life inside a church building, but 100% of your life should be shaped by the reign of Jesus. So if we're going to live justly, if we are going to be righteous people, we've got to do it beyond the church, right? The church should help shape us and help encourage us, but it's more than just going to church. And so she talks about examples of life. She talks about family life and how that's important. One way that we can live the righteous and just life is by being present in our families and living that in the fullness. She talks about our own resources and money. How do we view money? How are we shaped by money? Or do we shape money itself? Are we controlled by it, or do we control it? And then she talks about the church as being understood as one body together, so that we break down the barriers of nationality, of race, and socioeconomic differences to be true to the church. And that if the church is one, then we break through and reach across that. So that there are not poor and rich people in the church, but we are all one, and we are working to make things better. She talks about how the church overcame poverty for a moment, something that was talked about in the law, that there would be no poor among you. But in Acts, that actually happened because they were living out the life that Jesus had called them to in their everyday life. And so they took care of the poor. I do remember that she talks about those structures being messed up at times. And so that should tell us that sometimes our structures will not be exactly right, but we still need to continue to work and pursue. Today's culture, she says, often divides the practical from the spiritual. Yet the Bible always gives both practical life teachings and spiritual principles all at the same time. Then she concludes by saying, what matters is how we love our own families, steward our money, connect to the vulnerable, and respond to those committing injustice. Justice and righteousness belong in all parts of the world, which means they belong in all parts of our world. And here I think we see how this work of justice and righteousness is not to be compartmentalized. It's not just a ministry that the church does, that I think it becomes the everyday work of the church and the everyday work of the Christian, that we are called to do justice and to walk humbly with God and to love mercy. So I want to thank you for your work in justice and how you are trying your best to live out this life. I want you to look at the questions below to ponder and then respond in the comment section as you see fit. I thank you for being a part. And we have one more week, the last chapter and the appendix. So we will wrap it up next week. Thank you for being here. Thank you for reading. God bless.